Good afternoon. So wonderful to see all these friendly faces. My name is Kimberly Goodman. I am the executive director here at the McConnell Arts Center. How many of you have never been in this building before? Okay, welcome. Hello in the front. This is the original Worthington High School, built in 1915, opened as the McConnell Arts Center in 2009. A little bit of housekeeping for today. We are going to go straight through in this program with no break. So Dr. Lepper will do his presentation, and then there'll be lots of time for questions, which I know I will have questions. There are restrooms on all 3 levels of this building. And after the presentation is done, I hope that you explore and see the art. This is art by high school students, and it is extraordinary. And all of these students were chosen to be part of this exhibition here at the MAC. We want to thank the Worthington Spotlight, who is our sponsor for this series. This event is being recorded and live streamed, so if you have your cell phone, can you just make sure that the ringer is off? That can be very loud on the live stream. And I just want to tell you about a really exciting event. Besides, we have many events coming up, but this Friday evening is a concert of bluegrass music featuring Mike Compton, who has won a Grammy Award for his bluegrass music making, and Joe Newberry. So it's Newberry and Compton. And Mr. Newberry's been featured on Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion, remember that show? And the Ramblin' Bluegrass Ensemble will be the opening band Friday night, and they are an ensemble made up of Central Ohio musicians, and specifically Rich Baker, who is a part of that group, who for 38 years has been the host of Bluegrass Ramble, which you might have heard on WOSU on Saturday nights. So 7 p.m. this Friday, it's gonna be a lot of fun. I hope you can join us. So I first met Brad Lepper when he graced the stage of the MAC recently to discuss the newly named UNESCO World Heritage Site right here in Ohio. So I know you're gonna have a lot of questions and we're gonna learn together today, so welcome, Dr. Lepper.
Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the McConnell Arts Center and talking about my current favorite subject. And it's been my favorite subject for quite a while, actually. So the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks UNESCO World Heritage Site encompasses 8 separate sites that together tell this wonderful World Heritage-worthy story. The 8 sites are the Newark Earthworks, which includes the Octagon Earthworks and the Great Circle Earthworks, and the Fort Ancient Earthworks down in Warren County, Ohio. And those 3 sites are owned and managed by the Ohio History Connection. The other 5 sites are the sites that make up Hopewell Culture National Historical Park in Ross County, around Chillicothe in the Scioto Valley. There are many, many more Hopewell Earthwork sites around, but these are the only ones that were inscribed on the World Heritage List, or chosen for the nomination, I should say, because the United States Department of the Interior has some pretty stringent criteria for the sites that they'd be willing to nominate. So in order to be even considered for the United States to nominate you to a World Heritage Site, you have to first be either a National Historic Landmark or a National Park Service site, an NPS site. You have to be one of those 2 first. So you already have to have this really high bar. But World Heritage inscription means that your sites are not just significant at a local or even national level, they have this world significance, stories that we want to share with the world. So here we are. This is when in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 2023, when we were being considered for nomination. That's the chairman over there on the left. When you come up for nomination, it's an interesting experience because they have a brief recording from ICOMOS. Now, ICOMOS is the International Council for Monuments and Sites. They're a much smaller technical body that the World Heritage Committee asks to review nominations for World Heritage because they have all the technical expertise. And they send a reviewer to the site to inspect the sites. So we had a reviewer, I think he was a Canadian archaeologist, that went with us and went around all of the 8 sites over the course of a week. He prepares his recommendation, and then the ICOMOS has a bunch of desk reviewers that also review the nomination for technical details, and they put forth their recommendation. And that's summarized at the World Heritage Convention in about 5 minutes, they do this pre-taped presentation of your nomination and their recommendation. And this is where we learned that they recommended that we be inscribed on the World Heritage List. And this is the moment we're all standing up, clapping. It was such an amazing experience to be there, to be at these, when we first got there, there were only a few people in this big auditorium, but all the tables had the labels for the countries. And we're here like, this is amazing. We're going to present this to the world and hopefully become inscribed on the World Heritage List. And that's the moment when the chairman is putting his gavel down. After the nomination or after the sort of the evaluation was read, he says, this nomination's come up for consideration. Are there any concerns or questions? Hearing none, bang. And we're all like, that's it? We're done? Surely there's more. But no, this is all of us. And it was not only representatives from the National Park Service and the Ohio History Connection. I'm there on the far left if you're playing the Where's Waldo game. But we also had representatives from 5 of the federally recognized tribes that have ancestors that were part of all this. And those 5 tribes submitted recommendations or letters or tribal resolutions in support of our World Heritage nomination. So we wanted to bring their representatives too. And what was extraordinary, this is cool too, because at the end, when you're nominated, you're given, I think, 5 minutes. And usually that's the US government representative that does all the talking. And he was there, the ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Michael Ratney. You can't see him because he's in the middle clapping his hands like this, so he's covering his face. But he spoke for maybe 30 seconds, thanking Saudi Arabia for being such a good host, thanking UNESCO, the World Heritage Committee. And then he said he wanted to turn the remainder of his time over to Chief Glenna Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee so that she could be the one, as a descendant of these people, to make the statement. And she had a prepared statement, and she read it, and I don't think there was a dry eye in the house after that. I don't think she said it at this presentation because she was restricted in time. But one of the things that she says at many presentations that she's given that I've been at, that all of her life, she has only ever heard her ancestors referred to as savages. But now that these sites are on the World Heritage List, she's hearing her ancestors referred to as geniuses. And I think that's such an important sea change, and it's one of the reasons we've all been pursuing World Heritage inscription for these indigenous sites, so that these achievements of these indigenous people would be recognized right alongside all these other World Heritage sites that are so famous, such as the Great Pyramid of Egypt, the Colosseum, a lot of the sites in Rome, of course. I put Poverty Point on there because that's another Indigenous American Indian earthwork site. And it's a reminder that Indian mounds aren't just some one homogeneous thing. Indigenous people in North America have been building with earth, mounds and enclosures for thousands of years, many different cultures for many different purposes. So Poverty Point was built during the Archaic period, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The Hopewell sites are built 2,000 years ago. And then there's Cahokia Mounds in Illinois. That's also a World Heritage site. That's a Mississippian site that's about 1,000 years old. And they're all very different societies creating these earthworks for different purposes. We're focused on the Ohio earthworks, the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. And right in that name, you get the sense that the purpose for these sites is ceremony. This wonderful picture by Timothy Black, a Licking County local photographer, graced the cover of our nomination. We had wonderful designers and producers, and it was a wraparound cover, so there were pages that folded in, and you have to fold out the cover, and you could see this whole picture of the gateway to the Great Circle. To become a World Heritage Site, you have to demonstrate that you have something called outstanding universal value. I mean, that's this really high bar that you have to meet. And there are 7 different criteria that you can use by which to nominate it. And I remember earlier in the process when we were first discussing it, I'm looking over those 7 criteria and I said, we can hit all of them. We can hit a grand slam, and the Department of the Interior representatives are going, no, you don't want to do that. If you do all 7, your nomination dossier has to be 7 times bigger than it has to be. You only need 1 to make it, and they recommend you have a backup. because the one we picked was the very first one, Criterion 1. We believe these places were masterpieces of human creative genius. And that's the bar we wanted to hit. And the Department of the Interior folks that were working with us said, okay, but that's a really high bar, so have a backup. And we chose Criterion 3, which was simply a unique or exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or civilization. So we thought that was going to be a slam dunk. But we all wanted that big bar, that masterpieces of human creative genius. So there are various aspects to what define the outstanding universal value of these sites. And one of them is that they created these monumental earthworks with immense complexity that I'll talk about later, without all the things that normally the anthropological definition of civilizations is that they lived in cities and that they had a king or a queen or a pharaoh, and that they built monumental architecture and had armies and a system of writing, and they had agriculture to feed all the people that lived in the cities. And they had a hierarchical society that had the king at the top, of course, or the queen, and then nobles, and then merchants and commoners and so on. So a pyramid-shaped society. All of these things are said to be the requirements for doing this kind of activity. Well, the Hopewell culture has monumental architecture on a scale comparable to anything else that was being built at that same time anywhere else in the world. But they didn't have any of the other characteristics of a civilization. They have no kings, no queens, they have no cities. They have agriculture, but they're more like gardens associated with small settlements. So not only do they not have cities, archaeologists don't even call their places where they lived villages, because they're small, they're tiny. They're more like homesteads. Archaeologists call them hamlets, but what does that mean? They're small little communities with gardens where they're growing these crops. They also hunt, fish, and gather. And they probably lived in those places for a few years and then moved to a different place. So they were mobile and they were scattered all over the place. So some powerful message, religious message that resonated with all these people brought hundreds, thousands of those communities together at these places to first create and then to worship at these amazing places. Because there's no evidence that people lived there. In this painting, which was done for an exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago on Hopewell artifacts, you see there are little houses around. This was the Newark Earthworks, and I was responsible for working with the artist to get this right. And we have no direct evidence at Newark that these little scattered houses were around there, because the city of Newark and Heath have just sort of engulfed the site completely. But at Fort Ancient, archaeologists have looked at some of the surrounding landscape, and they find places where there are these small houses. Some of them are round, some of them are square. They're different kinds of houses, and they seem to be built over and over again in the same place, scattered around. And so my notion of those is not that those are people living there full time. Those are little settlements established by pilgrims coming from, as I'll tell you later, from literally the ends of their world to come to these places to worship for maybe a period of days or weeks and then go home. And then when they come back for the next one, they camp sort of in the same place and build their house again, whether their traditions dictated a circular house or a square house or whatever. So that's what these houses are meant to represent: temporary housing for pilgrims who are here in hugely large numbers to celebrate, to participate in important ceremonies. So this is the Newark Earthworks. This is my favorite site, because this is where I've been working for 40-some years to learn more about this site. I mean, all of the Hopewell Earthworks are significant, and I'll mention them, but this is sort of near and dear to my heart, and it's what I know best, so it's what I prefer to talk about. If we get Dr. Brett Ruby from Hopewell Culture National Historical Park here, he'll give an overlapping sort of Venn diagram presentation, but he'll be focused on the sites in Chillicothe, and rightly so. So this is an early map drawn. It was published in 1848 in the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution. This shows the entire Newark Earthworks. Almost all of it has been obliterated, except 2 of the sites, the ones that are on the World Heritage Site, have been preserved. The circle and octagon in the upper left-hand corner, and the great circle at the bottom there. All the rest of those sites, if I had an aerial photograph to superimpose over that, you just see those islands of green and the rest of its cities. Now, just to compare the scale, so these are other World Heritage Sites that a couple of them, you already saw the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid would have fit comfortably inside the square enclosure there in the middle on the right. Stonehenge, do you see the little circle on the bottom of the octagon? So Stonehenge would fit inside that little circle, which is only little because it's next to these other gigantic earthworks. And the Roman Colosseum, so that octagon by itself is 50 acres. You could put 4 Roman Colosseums inside the octagon. That's the scale of this. The whole complex is 4.5 square miles, and a conservative estimate is that 7 million cubic feet of earth were moved to create these earthworks. The technology that these people used to construct these earthworks was quite literally as simple as you could imagine. Pointed sticks, clamshell hose, baskets, and they would find the earth that they wanted because they were very selective about the earth. They were like soil engineers too. They're picking the kinds of earth that will build monuments that will endure for centuries or millennia. And they were choosing different colors for different ceremonial purposes. But they would go and dig the earth up, scrape it into a basket, and carry it one after another after another. And here it's 7 million cubic feet of earth. So the technology was simple. But what we have learned in the past 40 years or more is that there's the knowledge that's incorporated into these earthworks is anything but simple or primitive, as some people might have said. So the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks encompass different kinds of earthworks, geometric earthworks, that is what it sort of just says there, earthworks built in geometric shapes. This is the Great Circle. It's 1,200 feet in diameter. That's 4 American football fields. There are also hilltop enclosures. That is, earthworks that aren't defined by geometry. The earthworks wind their way around the edges of the bluffs on which they're built. And Fort Ancient makes you think it's an ancient fort, because that's what the early Europeans thought when they encountered it. It looks very similar to sort of Iron Age forts in Europe. But it also is a place of ceremony. There are ditches that some people have considered to be defensive moats, but they're inside the walls. They're filled with water, and I think it's sort of a ceremonial boundary that creates this water boundary surrounding the ceremonies that are taking place. The Great Circle also had an interior ditch that had been filled with water. So water is a key aspect of the architecture of this ceremonial architecture, so it probably had an important significance. Here you can see one of the ponds at Fort Ancient. We're inside the enclosure where the water is still there. You can't experience that at Newark, but you can go to Fort Ancient and experience that still at the right time of year. And then there are earthworks that are kind of a combination of the two, geometric earthworks and the hilltop enclosures. This is the Hopewell Mound Group. This is probably, according to the late Dr. Nomi Grieber from the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, one of my mentors, she thinks this is where the Hopewell explosion was ignited, where it first happened, and then it flowed out from there. But this is it's the largest enclosure of the Hopewell world. On the right-hand side, there's a perfect square attached to it. The burial mound there inside that little D-shaped enclosure inside is the largest burial mound in the Hopewell world. It has this unglamorous name of Mound 25. We got to find a better name for that. But it had some of the most amazing regalia of any of the regalia we've found in Hopewell mounds, the largest collection of it, certainly. But the wall to the north actually goes up into the surrounding hills and then comes back down. So there's sort of that element of a hilltop enclosure and the geometry. So it's a bit it's a bit unique. Mound City is another really unique one. It's vaguely geometric in that it's a square, but it's a square with rounded corners. The interesting thing about that shape, Mound City is filled with all these different burial mounds. And when they were excavated back in the 18 and early 1900s, when they got to the bottom, they were found to cover a wooden structure that had the exact same shape as the outer wall, a square with rounded corners. And within that wooden structure, people would build these clay crematory basins. And they also have a very similar shape to that, a square with rounded corners. Most of those were more rectangular, but it's a very similar shape. And those are the basins where ancestors were cremated, offerings of regalia, sometimes with them, or sometimes just offerings of regalia were also burned in some of these offering basins. So it's really interesting. It's almost like nested Russian dolls. You've got the clay basins with that shape in which the ancestors themselves are resting. You've got this house that encloses a whole different number of these different burials there. And then you've got the larger enclosure that encloses all the mounds. So it's almost like a house enclosing the mounds that enclose a house that enclose, not a house, but a repository of ancestral remains. So the shape of that mound was determined by the shape of the things that preceded the mound on that landscape. And it's virtually unique. I don't know of another mound like that. Now, getting into some of the geometry in particular, this is the circle and octagon at Newark. It's the Octagon Earthworks is what it's called. You see the big red arrow there. That's pointing to what's called the observatory circle. And it has that name. The 1848 map and Smithsonian publication referred to it as Observatory Mound because down at the bottom, let me go point at this. That's a large mound that was built over a former gateway. So there was a parallel walled gateway, similar to the gateway at the Great Circle, similar to the gateway there between the circle and the octagon. And at some point, they built a mound that blocked it off. And that mound is about twice as high as the rest of the earthworks. So in 1848, it's a good place to get up on to get a good view of the earthworks. But that name, we're going to come back to that name because it has a whole new significance now. But that circle is precisely 1,054 feet in diameter. And it's nearly a perfect circle. That is, it's about as perfect as we could build today on that scale. So the observatory circle, we have it actually defines a unit of measure that we use and that we find repeatedly in the Hopewell world. It's abbreviated the OCD. Not that OCD. This is the observatory circle diameter. This is a page from our nomination dossier that shows all the 8 sites and how that unit of measure, that OCD, or half of it, or a quarter of it, occurs in all of the earthworks except for the Great Circle. But the Great Circle has its own diameter. It's 1,200 feet in diameter. We also find that. And one of the interesting places where we find that is at Circleville. I mean, some of you have probably been to Circleville. It's the Pumpkin Festival and so on. The name comes from the fact that there were 2 circles, one inside the other connected to a square. It's entirely gone now because of the city of Circleville being built over it. There are a few historic markers now that refer to it there. But the 2 circles, the outer circle was 1,200 feet in diameter, the same diameter as Newark's Great Circle. And the inner circle was 1,054 feet, the same diameter as Newark's Octagon Circle. So it's as if you put one of those circles inside the other and attached a square to it. So this shows overwhelmingly that these people had a common unit of measure and that they could survey and lay out monumental geometry on an amazing scale over and over again in different places. I mean, one wonders if there was some sort of guild of surveyors that would go around to do this. I don't know, but there certainly was knowledge that allowed them to do this wherever they wanted to do it. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Well, it'll come to me. I'll just go on. So let's just go to the next slide. We see this geometry at Newark, especially. So the great circle, the circumference of the great circle, is equal to the perimeter of the perfect square that it was attached to. So that's making a hidden geometrical connection between those two earthworks. And they're all already connected by these parallel walled passageways that I think were processional ways by which people entered the enclosures, and then moved from one to the other in some sort of choreographed ceremonial processions. But in addition to those physical connections of those passageways, there's also this hidden geometry. The area of that perfect square is equal to the area of the observatory circle, to a very close precision. So it's not what the Pythagoreans talked about when they said it was squaring the circle, but it's kind of a version of that. It's kind of creating circles with the same area as squares and vice versa. What about the octagon? I already told you that it was the biggest one there. So none of those areas or anything, or circumferences or perimeters matches. But if you draw a square inside it, drawing lines from alternate vertices of the octagon, the sides of that square are 1,054 feet, 1,054 feet, the same as the diameter of the circle to which it's attached to. And the area of that hidden square is equal to the area of the great circle, which is like an even deeper level of hidden geometry there. And finding all these layers and finding all these connections, it's not accidental. I mean, there is an incredible knowledge here that's not just the knowledge, but the capacity to create massive architecture that embodies all of this knowledge. The distance from the center of the octagon to the center of the square is exactly 6 times the OCD. The distance from the center of the observatory circle to the center of the great circle is also 6 times the OCD. So once again, these weren't laid out haphazardly. And this is the kind of argument for Newark that has led me to believe this wasn't built sort of one thing at a time, sort of they built a circle and later built a square and then later brought everything together. I think this was a composition that a Hopewell intellect, like Michelangelo or something, or Leonardo da Vinci or some woman with that kind of intellect, because both men and women could have high status in Hopewell societies. Well, when I say high status, I've already said there are no kings, right? No queens. What I mean by that is there are people buried in the mounds who have all sorts of regalia. And if you look at the whole Hopewell world, there tend to be more men, but there are a lot of women. And when you look at the 2 people in the various mounds who are buried with the most regalia, the number 1 is a man, but the number 2 is a woman. So lots of men were buried with much less regalia than that woman. So whoever this architect was, I think all this knowledge comes from Chillicothe. And in fact, all those elements can be found in Chillicothe. The circle and octagon is repeated at High Bank Works. The circle is identical in size. The octagon's a little smaller. That's part of the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. A circle and square combination is at Hopewell Earthworks, which is also in the nomination. And our big oval filled with burial mounds is very much like the Newark version of Mound City, an enclosure with all the burial mounds in it. And that's something I meant to emphasize. That's probably what I forgot when I was talking, that we have this conception that Indian mounds are burial mounds. And that's not true. Most of these enclosures are the walls of giant cathedrals. The burial mounds, at least at Newark, were focused in that, well, what Squire and Davis in this map, they just show it as kind of a horseshoe-shaped enclosure, but we actually know it went a complete oval that surrounded them, sort of similar to Mound City. Mound City had the round-cornered squares. But so there were lots of burial mounds, but they were like focused in one part of the earthworks. The rest of these are not. Although given that they're all connected by these ceremonial passageways, it would seem that mortuary ceremonialism was a big part of what these people were doing. But so those people buried in the mounds, even the ones with lots of regalia, when you compare, and this is knowledge that was gained from the centuries when archaeologists thought it was okay to dig up burial mounds and study the human remains and the artifacts and such, but we've learned extraordinary things from that. We're now in the process of repatriating those human remains to the indigenous tribes for reburial, or for whatever they want to do with them to commemorate them. But I don't know. I don't want to sort of defend those archaeological practices now that we would not do. We would not dig burial mounds now. But the knowledge gain, I think, was really important, because what we could see by studying the human remains was that even people buried with the most regalia, when you look at their muscle attachments were the same as everybody else. They worked just as hard every day as everybody else doing normal stuff. If you look at their bone chemistry, they ate pretty much the same thing everybody else was eating. Now, 1,000 years later in Cahokia, totally different. That's a city with 20,000 people probably. At the middle is this gigantic flat-top pyramid you can go stand on today. It's called Monk's Mound. There was a house on top of that. Well, I shouldn't say house. There was a palace on top of that. And there's a king buried there. And you can tell he's a king because like 40 or 50 young women were sacrificed to be buried when he was buried. His muscle attachments, he probably never worked a day in his life. And his bones indicate he had much more access to meat than everybody else that lived in the city. So that's the difference in 1,000 years. Now you've got a king saying, build me a pyramid, build me a city, build me this or that. And people would do it. Here, it's not at all the same. Here it's people, just people, inspiring other people, working with other people to do these grand, amazing things, but nobody's pushing them, nobody's making them. Nobody could make them because they live in these little scattered communities. And if somebody comes over and says, hey, we want you to build this mound, and they didn't want anything to do with it, they could just move. They could go somewhere else. But they all work together, probably hundreds, thousands of people to do this. And for me, that's one of the big outstanding universal value lessons here is, how did they do it? How did they get thousands of people, whole societies, to cooperate, to achieve one great thing, or many great things, actually, of course, with this? It's extraordinary, but I think it's a message we need to relearn. So that's the geometry and extra stuff. We've also learned about astronomy built into the earthworks. This is the circle and octagon at Newark, lined up with where the moon rises at its northernmost point on the eastern horizon. Now, I don't know about any of you. Some of you may have done some reading about this. When I got started in this aspect of it and first met Ray Hively and Robert Horn, who are in this picture, I had no idea there was a lunar cycle. I mean, I thought I was smart. I had a PhD in archaeology. But it's like, I can't remember who said it, but it's a wonderful quote. We're all ignorant just about different subjects. But it turns out, I mean, because for me, like, the moon is over there, next night it's over there, sometimes it's out during the day, what's that all about? I never noticed a rhythm. I mean, I knew about the phases of the moon, but the moon does basically, and this is how I've sort of simplified the explanation so that I can understand it, and I've been told that, well, okay, it's not that simple, and it's like, I know. But in general, the moon does exactly the same thing that the sun does. So the sun has a northernmost rise on the eastern horizon, and that's the summer solstice. 6 months later, it has a southernmost rise, and it's worked its way slowly down the horizon during that time. That's the winter solstice. And then 6 months later, you're back. And it's a rhythm we all understand practically in our bones because it's the rhythm of the seasons. The moon does the same thing, but it does it every month. So over a period of 18.6 years, at one end of that cycle, there is the absolute northernmost rise of the moon. And then the next nights, it's rising further to the south, further to the south. 2 weeks later, it's rising at its absolute southernmost rise. And then 2 weeks later, it's back. Well, the next month, that angle contracts a little bit. And the next month, that angle contracts a little bit more. And the next month, that angle contracts a little bit more. And 9.3 years later, the northernmost rise of the moon for that month is at its southernmost point, and the southernmost rise of the moon is at its northernmost point. And then the next month it widens again, and the next month it widens again, and 18.6 years later, you're back at the beginning. So it would have taken, especially in Ohio with our cloudy skies, probably a century of observations to figure that cycle out. And not only, well, this will be in the next slide, but not only are those two alignments, the northernmost rise of the moon and the southernmost rise of the moon, built into the earthworks, there are 8 alignments: the northernmost, the southernmost, the northern minimum, the southern minimum, and then 4 corresponding set points. In that circle and octagon, there are alignments to all 8 of those points on the horizon built into the architecture. And these are the 2 guys that discovered it. And this is worth a little bit of a digression, because they weren't out to prove anything. They didn't have this wild, crazy idea and said, let's find evidence to prove this. It was the exact opposite of that. This was about the time that Gerald Hawkins had published this book, Stonehenge Decoded. And he was arguing that Stonehenge included all these alignments to the summer solstice and the equinox, and he even described it as kind of a Neolithic computer. And that's Bob Horn on the left. He was the professor of philosophy, and on the right is Ray Hively. He was a physicist and astronomer, and they were working at Earlham College in Indiana. And they were teaching a class that term, and they wanted to incorporate a critical thinking exercise for their students. So they were looking at this book, and they said, they didn't believe it. Yeah. They said, Stonehenge doesn't have these elaborate solar alignments in it. It's just that it's a complicated monument. And anytime you build a complicated alignment that you can draw dozens of lines through, just by chance, some of them are going to point to the summer solstice or the equinox. So you take Stonehenge and put it on a roulette wheel and spin it 1,000 times. 997 times out of 1,000, you'll find a solstice alignment, sometimes maybe 2 or 3. So that's their thing. These people just built this monument, and it just happens to have these alignments in it that other astronomers in the future are looking at and finding and thinking they've discovered something that the ancient people were doing. So they figured, these ancient people weren't that smart. They didn't care what was going on in the sky. It's just all chance. So as part of this exercise, Bob Horn had been to Newark. I mean, they couldn't take their students to Stonehenge, but they said the Newark Octagon has all these different openings. Each of the walls is pointing in 2 different directions. We'll go there and say, oh, look, here's a summer solstice alignment. It's just the happenstance when you build something complicated with enough possible alignments, some of them are going to be significant to us sort of arbitrarily. So they go to Newark, plot, survey, draw every line they can, and there's not a single solar alignment. And they're like disturbed, because that's statistically significant that there isn't a solar alignment in all those possible alignments. And so they're going, well, you wouldn't deliberately build something just to not have solar alignments. That seems dumb. Well, maybe it's lined up to something else. What else is up there? It's like, oh, well, the moon. So they start looking at that, and that's where it all starts. There's that alignment, there's that one, there's that one. This is my next slide. All of them are built into that architecture. So that's the northernmost rise. You sight across this wall, that's the southernmost rise. And all the other alignments are in there too. And that's actually a picture taken by my friend Tim Black, that's a photographer, showing the moon rising at its, not the most recent was actually this March, but 18.6 years before that, we were out there, people watching the moon rise intentionally for the first time in the thousands of years that separate us. And that is the moon rising in alignment with the Octagon Earthworks. Now, if you're not like, oh my gosh, what's going on? It gets even more complicated, or at least there's more in it. So this is from one of Ray Hively and Robert Horn's most recent publications. They did their basic research in 1980. Oh, and I didn't mention, when they first got these results, they were really excited. So they went to the person who was the foremost Hopewell archaeologist at that time and said, here, look at this. And he looked at it, and then he laughed at them, and he said, no, you don't understand. This is just chance. These people were savages. They couldn't do this. I'm like, oh my gosh. So this, Heiblingshorn looked at, so that line between the center of the observatory circle and the center of the Great Circle, that distance is 6 OCDs. Turns out, if you continue that line to the southeast, it points to the southern maximum moonrise. And if you project it backwards, it goes to this really prominent hilltop overlooking the valley. And if you stand on that hilltop and sight through the center of the square, you're pointing to the southern minimum moonrise. And they're suggesting, and I'm not sure I'm entirely with them on this, they think all these lunar alignments were worked out by people standing on hilltops watching the moon over and over again, and then the sun too, for that matter. And for me, that it makes more sense to be in the valley, in the earthworks, where you're participating in that cosmic convergence, not up where you're just sort of looking on a hilltop and pondering. You know, it seems to work here, but I don't know. It's just one of those things. And this is kind of, it seems to me this is making the argument more complicated than it has to be, although maybe it's true. Maybe this is how they did it. Turns out then the other circle and octagon in Chillicothe, High Bank Works, also has all these alignments. It's oriented at exactly 90 degrees to Newark circle and octagon. So in this site, that's the northernmost rise of the moon instead of that. So now they've got the two cases. They've actually gone on and found some of these astronomical alignments into many, many of the other Hopewell sites. But these were the first two that they did back in the 80s. Sadly, that picture on the left is what High Bank Works looks like now. It's preserved, it's got wonderful archaeological integrity below the ground, but all the walls have mostly been flattened. And this is the one of the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks that is not open to the public. It's a research preserve. The only reason it's not open to the public, though, is because the one road leading into it goes over a railroad tracks where there's no barrier or warning lights. So there's some level of danger. So it's not currently open to the public. Sometimes they've done public tours, but you have to watch for that. But all the rest of the sites are open to the public. So why? Why are they putting all this sacred geometry and astronomy into these sites? This is an essay by the late Vine Deloria Jr., an American Indian activist and scholar and author. He wrote the famous book, Custer Died for Your Sins. This is an essay he wrote in a journal that was, it's not about ancient architecture or the indigenous architecture. It's about American Indian architecture in general. And the essay is called Power and Place Equal Personality. But this is the closest I think I've been able to come to an indigenous voice articulating exactly what I think is happening at Newark and High Bank Works and these other places. Wherever possible, the larger cosmos was represented and reproduced to provide a context in which ceremonies could occur. Thus, people did not feel alone. They participated in cosmic rhythms. And personally, I mean, I have not, I have no indigenous heritage. I'm not a student of indigenous religions. But standing in the circle and octagon and watching that moonrise, I did feel like I was participating in cosmic rhythms. It was amazing. And I hope you all get to do that someday. You just have to wait another 18.6 years. Actually, in several months, over various months, because of the complications of that cycle, sometimes it will be coming very, very close, almost indistinguishable close to that northernmost rise again. And I'm hoping we can have public observances on that. The one we did on the northernmost rise of the moonrise was taking place at around noon. So it's like hard to see anyway. Although I've got a colleague, Jeff Gill, who does some tours. He thinks the daylight ones were even cooler. Because at night, you're sitting there, you're waiting. It's nothing like watching a sunrise because there's no sort of glow. It's just you're watching, and you know the NASA tables say it's supposed to be rising now. But we've got trees for it to go through. And then suddenly in the trees, you start seeing like a spark. And then suddenly it gets bigger and then comes up above the trees. And it's kind of magical. But Jeff goes out and watches all of them. And he said the most recent one was too cloudy for him to see, but he'd been out to watch other of these moonrises, and he says during that it's really cool because you know when it's going to rise, and you're watching, and it's like nowhere, But then suddenly, after another 10, 15 minutes, suddenly the moon materializes in the sky when it gets bright enough and high enough above the horizon to finally not be washed out by the sunlight or something. And he says that's almost more magical, because it's like it's there, invisible, and then suddenly it becomes visible. And what that must have been like for indigenous people watching it happen, I think that's really cool. So the final thing I want to talk about in terms of the outstanding universal value, and one of the things that gave me a clue as to the overwhelmingly ceremonial and religious aspects of these sites. This is what's called the Hopewell interaction sphere. And that's kind of a generic kind of name to say, yeah, there's something going on, some kind of interaction, but we don't know what it is. When I was an undergraduate, which of course was a long time ago, this was being taught as a trade network. So we've got marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico showing up in Ohio Mounds. We've got copper from southern Canada. We've got all the way on the far left, that's obsidian, a black volcanic glass. When that was first discovered in Hopewell Mounds, I mean, there were these like gigantic spear points that aren't, of course, real spear points. There's sort of symbols of spear points like this big. And there were like 20 of those that were like broken deliberately into pieces and burned on an altar at the Hopewell Mound Group. We know now that every volcano has its own unique chemical fingerprint. People used to think that obsidian might have come from Mexico, and they found this long-lost connection between the Aztecs and the Hopewell. But it turns out 80% of it comes from Obsidian Cliff in Yellowstone Park. And the other 20% comes from nearby Utah at a place called Bear Gulch. So all of it comes from the Rocky Mountains, and this isn't trade at all. I usually like to go to the map and do this. But if you picture superimposing on that map a graph with, on the upright axis, how much obsidian you've got, and then the lower axis is distance. So if this were trade, what you would see, village to village trade, is the people at Yellowstone were sitting on the obsidian, so they had all they wanted. So they trade a bunch with neighboring villages. And then those villages end up having a lot of obsidian. So they've got more than they need. So they trade with the villages next to them. And those people trade their lesser amount with the next village. And then you start getting smaller and smaller amounts of obsidian to trade. Eventually, before you get to the Mississippi River, you've run out of obsidian entirely. But then if you keep going, suddenly there's a big spike in Ohio. So one of two things that archaeologists have been smart enough to think about, and I'll do the one first that I agree with, is that pilgrims from the ends of the world are bringing precious stuff from where they live to these earthworks, which are pilgrimage centers like Mecca or Jerusalem, and leaving them as offerings, and then maybe staying there, maybe going back home, probably going back home for the most part. And that's what this represents. This represents sort of the religious interaction of pilgrims coming here, leaving offerings, and going home. The other idea, and this is based on some work by an anthropologist named Mary Helms in Panama, that she studied shamans in these communities, and they acquire status by going on walkabout. So the shaman will say, I'm going, take walk in whatever, some direction, until they find something cool, like, oh, look at this amazing crystal. And then they bring that back to the village, and that sort of elevates their status in the hierarchy, or the religious hierarchy. So you get more status by finding cooler stuff, and you find cool stuff by wandering off into the wilderness and finding it, bringing it back. I find it hard to believe that that's what's happening here for a couple reasons. First, they're covering huge, massive distances. The Yellowstone is what, I don't know, it's 2,000 miles or something. But the other thing is, what that shamans going on walkabouts doesn't explain is why these earthen enclosures are so huge. I mean, I've tried to convey their size with, you could put 4 Roman Colosseums in just the Octagon. But there's a more human estimate that comes from when the Great Circle was the county fairgrounds. So that site was saved because Newark made the Great Circle the county fairgrounds. It was a training camp for the Civil War. After the Civil War, there's a grand reunion of the soldiers and sailors who served from Ohio, held there. And President Rutherford B. Hayes came there to give a talk. And with him was General Garfield, soon to be President Garfield, and William Tecumseh Sherman. And the Cincinnati newspaper says 20 to 30,000 people gathered in the Great Circle to listen to these orations. So did 20 to 30,000 indigenous people ever gather there 2,000 years ago? Well, if not, why build it so big? They didn't have to be. These aren't community churches. Remember that small circle I showed you at the bottom of the octagon that Stonehenge would fit in? The Adena culture, the culture that immediately preceded Hopewell, those were their community churches. Little circles, 200 feet in diameter, and probably a couple of communities would come together there for their religious observances. The Hopewell are living basically the same way in tiny little hamlets and homesteads, but thousands of those people are now coming together at these places. And some of those thousands, I think, are coming from the ends of the world with offerings, and that's why they have to make these earthworks so big. So this is my last slide. This is to show sort of a more aesthetic, artistic appreciation, because these places aren't just geometric and astronomical and scientific and incredible architecture. It's also art. Barnett Newman was an abstract expressionist painter from the United States, and this is from his private journal in 1940. He came to see the Hopewell Earthworks, and he says, walking inside the Fort Ancient and Newark Earthworks, one is confounded by a multiplicity of sensations, that here are the greatest works of art on the American continent, that here in the seductive Ohio Valley are perhaps the greatest art monuments in the world. And that's a page or an untitled work that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that I found on their webpage that seems to suggest a great circle kind of motif taking place there. Although I don't know, it might be something entirely different. But that's why I put it up there in conjunction with the great circle picture. So these are incredible architecture. We work with a architectural historian named John Hancock, who was just recently retired from the University of Cincinnati. And he says that all the architecture that he studied like, I don't know, 6, 7 kinds of architecture. He says Hopewell architecture is something entirely different, entirely unique. I mean, and he calls it uncanny because of its scale, a combination of its scale and precision. So you build a circle that's 1,050 feet in diameter. You could fudge it a little bit, and no one would ever know. You know, you'd go out walking, yeah, this is a perfect circle. But it's perfect circle on an incredible scale. Why? Why that fastidiousness to have, create near perfection when small errors wouldn't ever be noticed by anybody except maybe you or except maybe the Great Spirit. And Hively and Horn were speculating that perhaps, well, and we know in fact from American Indian oral traditions that of course the moon wasn't thought to be a rock orbiting the earth. It was a spiritual being. And the sun was a spiritual being. And in some traditions, the moon is first woman who creates all life on earth, and the sun is her, is it her son? It must be her mate. I guess it's different in different traditions. But so they're living spiritual beings with their own agency and discovering their rhythms and sort of incorporating those rhythms in the architecture was a way of, I think, making these places more sacred, making what happened in them more sacred, which I think can be appreciated on so many levels. But if you go there, and I've had this experience with people, I'm sure I told this story when I was here the last time, and this is kind of where my journey begins, because I hadn't been hired by the Ohio History Connection very long. I'm working full-time then at the Great Circle and Flint Ridge, and we're moving from Columbus, and we had to get a car, and my wife with my 2 young sons, then I guess Ben would have been 6, and maybe Peter must have been 4, so Ben must have, anyway, doesn't matter. They're across the street from the Great Circle at a car dealership, and the car dealer's chatting her up, how much can you afford? What do you do? What does your husband do? And my oldest son, Ben, then he was probably about 6, said, my daddy's an archaeologist. He says, oh, really? And my wife says, yeah, he works at the mounds. And he says, what mounds? And she goes, points across the street. And he follows her finger, and he's like, what? He sees a grassy hillside. He doesn't see a monument that people created. And my wife comes home and I'm like, oh my gosh, my work's cut out for me. People that live across the street in a town with Indian Mound Mall, Mound Builders Dairy Bar, Mound Builders Dry Cleaner. I mean, they haven't figured it out yet. But then I think that relates to what John Hancock said, that it's an architecture that's uncanny, that's totally unlike the architecture we're used to seeing in the Western traditions. And that's why if you come there without some background, you're like, huh. The other story I tell, there's a book, Lives in Ruins, I think is the name of it. And I was reading this book. It's all about archaeologists. I was loving it. It was great. And I get to the last chapter, and the author is talking about, she's on a bus ride to Machu Picchu. And she said, there's this like annoying woman in the back that's going on and on about these Hopewell Earthworks. And I happen to know who that woman is, by the way. She was on our team. And then what she says is, we're going to Machu Picchu, for heaven's sake. Why is she talking about these piles of dirt? You know, stone will always trump dirt, you know. And this is where I've sort of got my signature line now, because I think it was I was being interviewed on CBS Sunday morning. And it came to that question, you know, it's like, yeah, some people think these are piles of dirt. And I said, but they're piles of dirt in the same way that the Parthenon is a pile of rocks. So, I think that was the last slide. So, questions? Yes, sir. That's a great question. The question was about all this stuff coming into Ohio, was anything going in the other direction? And I meant to mention that because that kind of negates the trade question. Because almost nothing is, and nothing is going as far as Wyoming. But what we do see, and this is something that I saw in the exhibits at Fort Flint Ridge when I was there 40 years ago when I first getting started. They had a map showing places around the United States where Flint Ridge Flint was found. And Flint Ridge Flint goes like down into the southeast and you know, at least to places this side of the Mississippi River. So it has a pretty wide distribution. And that got me interested. So I started trying to research all those dots. And those dots could be like 5 bladelets, which are like little tiny, like replaceable razor blades made out of Flint Ridge Flint. Like in Tennessee, in eastern Tennessee, some of the mica can be available there. There's a site called Pinson Mounds. That's a Hopewell Earthworks site, same period, more in central to western Tennessee. So it's not terribly close. But there, in one of those mounds, they got like some Flint Ridge Flint. And I compare it to at Newark. There was a small mound off to the side in that big oval that the Ohio Canal went through. And it said that 20 to 30 bushels of mica came out of that little mound. We don't know what came out of some of the other mounds because they were just simply destroyed. But anyway, at this mound in Tennessee, you know, kind of somewhat near the mica, there were like 12 bladelets, like teeny tiny little bladelets. And the Hopewell worked Flint Ridge on an industrial scale. If you've ever been there, there's these giant quarry pits. Flint Ridge was used since the Ice Age, and the Hopewell, I think, are the ones that dug all the pits because they were using it on an industrial scale, really. And they were making 2 basic things, those bladelets, and they were making triangular-shaped bifaces that you could turn into a spear point. And I think they were making them in huge quantities to give the pilgrims that were coming. And because when I got interested in this idea of pilgrimage, I found out that something common to Buddhist pilgrimage, Taoist, Christian, Muslim, is often you're given a pilgrim's token for having made the journey. And you go back home with your Flint Ridge Flint bladelet and you save it, you know. And then it comes time to say, cut your daughter's wedding cake or something, and you pull that out, and everybody's like, oh, you've been to Chillicothe or you've been to Newark. And it's like, why, yes, I have. You know, and it gives people elevated status if they're able to have those kinds of things. So that's why I think that's that reinforces the pilgrimage model rather than a trade model. Because if it's trade, it's like, I'll give you these 12 bladelets for 20 bushels of mica. I was like, yeah, yeah, that sounds fair. But it's almost like that because they're invested with such spiritual energy that maybe they are, but I don't think it's trade. I don't think trade is the best explanation. But I'm sure trade is going on because trade is something all peoples do everywhere. So trade is part of the picture. But all this mountain of regalia and stuff that's showing up is, I think, better understood through the pilgrimage model. Yes? Okay, well, I've already forgotten your first question, so ask that later, or ask that again. But both criteria was accepted on both criteria. So they are masterpieces of human creative genius, but they're also exceptional testimony to a unique culture, or cultural tradition, or civilization. But yeah, we got both of them. So we're under criterion 1 and I think 3. And we got in on the first shot, and we worked really hard to do that because, and often that's the case, but so when the UNESCO is considering it, they can either say yes, or they can say no, or they can say, we're going to defer this and we need to have more questions answered. And sometimes that happens. When I was there, when our group was there, we got to see nominations that were dumped, some nominations that were bad get passed because it's like everything else, there's politics involved. So we had no idea what would happen because we knew this was during the first Trump administration and they'd quit paying the UNESCO dues. So UNESCO was mad at us about that. The Ohio History Connection voluntarily paid sort of it's not a bribe exactly, but it was a kind of a fee for the nomination to reimburse folks for the work reviewing the nomination, which normally the state pays, like the government pays, but they weren't paying that, so we paid that voluntarily. And it was, I don't know, $6,000. I don't remember what it was, but it would have been significant for my budget, but maybe not for the Ohio History Connections. But even the Ohio History Connection, it was a big bite, but we wanted to do it because we thought this will help ICOMOS, UNESCO, see that we're making the effort. Plus, we weren't trying to glorify the United States of America. We're trying to glorify the achievements of Indigenous American Indians. And we thought that would resonate with UNESCO much more than like, this is George Washington's house. Of course, it's already on the UNESCO site, I think. One of those is. Anyway, but yeah. Any other questions? Yes, and then you. I mean, like new research into the, I mean, that's been happening to me for the last 40 years, I guess. I mean, I remember when I gave my first paper at a conference, I don't know, like in '93 or something. But anyway, at the conference, I was like, this is everything I've been able to find in the literature. And I said, and I'm giving this at conferences to other archaeologists. And I would always say at the end, so if anybody knows anything else about the Newark Earthworks, please let me know. And maybe it was the second time I'd done that. Nomi Grieber, my mentor from Cleveland, she came up. She was like the goddess of Hopewell. But she came up to me and she said, Brad, I was doing research at the American Antiquarian Society in Boston, and she was researching the Hopewell Mountain Group, and she said, but I did see in the catalog that they have a map of the Newark Earthworks. And I'm like, okay, that's a good lead. It's probably one of the maps I've already seen. But so I sent them a letter, and they said, oh yeah, this is it. It's a map and a 22-page manuscript that goes with it. And they wanted to charge me, I don't know, $15 for a roll of microfilm. And back then it was like, well, are we not going to have pizza on Friday? I can afford that, I suppose. Sent them the money. A couple weeks later, this microfilm arrives. This was back before the Newark Library had a printer for their microfilm, but they did have a microfilm reader. And so I go down to Newark and I spool it up and I'm like, it was the map like I have never seen of Newark. 22 pages of detailed explanations. Two brothers, James Salisbury and Charles Salisbury, in 1862, did this massive survey. They lived in Newark. James was a physician. I think Charles was like an engineer or something. But they worked together on this survey. They were amateur archaeologists. Of course, there weren't any real professional archaeologists back then. Did this incredible survey better than the one I showed you before, but the other one I showed you is more iconic. And one of the things they did, the Squire and Davis map, maybe I can go back to that. I don't want to, how do I do that? Here, well, let's go back one more time. Nope, too far. So I'll just, Squire and Davis map shows these two walls coming off that corner, just sort of squiggling due south. And the only mention they say of how long it is parallels 2.5 miles long. It's written right along there. And I'm reading the Salisbury notes, and they plot it very differently. It takes this is Main Street, modern Main Street, Newark, and on the Salisbury map in the notes, it takes 2 angled turns here, but then goes off 31 degrees west of south. As far as they traced it. They said 2.5 miles. James and Charles Salisbury said they traced it through tangled swamps and over hills, still keeping its undeviating course for 6 miles. And it was still going. So it's like, it's still going. And I read that, and that was the thing that jumped out at me, because like, I did my undergraduate work at the University of New Mexico, did my field school on ancestral Puebloan sites. Yeah. We went to Chaco Canyon on a couple of field trips. The ancestral Puebloans built long, straight roads that went miles and miles and miles, and parallel berms on either side of them. And I'm looking at the Salisbury notes, and I'm saying, this sounds like those Chaco Canyon roads. So if it kept going, where would it be going? So, and this is back before GPS, So I got USGS quadrangle maps for like the whole corridor, laid them out on the floor of my museum, and with ruler and protractor, I was projecting that road if it went the same way. And I found it went straight to the heart of Chillicothe. 60 miles. And it doesn't go to any particular earthwork, it just goes to the center of this gigantic earthwork conglomeration around Chillicothe. And so I wrote an article in Archaeology Magazine, I think in 1993, called Searching for the Great Hopewell Road. And that's what I've called it. And I think it's a road like the ones in Chaco Canyon, like similar roads the Maya built, connecting some of their most important religious centers. And I think it's a route for pilgrimage for people in Chillicothe to follow this road. So that is something that's come out of, it's like you say, it's like you get one crumb and get another crumb and start building your castle in the sky or whatever, but trying to lay a foundation under it. That's what, I could come up with other examples, but you had a question.
I did. If they built these giant complexes, how did they let each other know? How did they communicate to let each other know it was time to come and work on the walls?
Well, one way, first of all, everybody knows what's going on. Indigenous people, like people everywhere, have networks. There's trade going on. So some person bringing trade in will know what the stories are being told in the other communities, and we'll be sharing them in this community, and along with trading stuff. So word gets around. It just happens. These aren't isolated communities. They're part of, they're networked. And then in terms of, if you're out in Wyoming, how do you know when to come? The northernmost rise of the moon is the northernmost rise of the moon for everybody in the northern hemisphere. So if you're watching the moon too, you're like, a couple more months since we're going to be getting the northernmost rise of the moon, so let's pack up and take our obsidian to Newark or Chillicothe, because that's like Oz. That's like the religious heart of North America. It's like for Catholics around the world, that's Rome, or that's where you go to the Vatican, to have your big moment. Sure. Yes, sir.
Question. The earthworks, I'm assuming they're still being discovered. Some earthworks are now still being discovered as we go forward. When was the most recent
Yeah. What we are doing now, I say we, that's like the royal we, it doesn't involve me so much, but there's particularly a guy that's not Dr. Jared Burks, works for Ohio Valley Archaeology. He's moved to Cambodia and he's got like a branch office there now, but he comes back to Ohio. He has discovered, I don't know how many, 30 different earthwork sites now by using geophysical remote sensing. So he goes out into fields, near where other earthworks were and surveys these blank fields and finds, it's sort of like high bank works. There's very few traces of it on the surface, but there's still the foundations are still visible underground that you can see with magnetometry or soil resistivity. The soil shows up differently. And he has, I think, personally discovered 20 new earthwork sites, not this big, but as big as like the small circles. And he's like the junction works is his discovery. Squire and Davis had mapped it. It was gone. He did a survey in the fields and found them all, even though they couldn't be seen. So yeah, that work is being done. It's also being done with LiDAR. Actually, there are people, the Ohio Historic Preservation Office, I can't remember what the guy's name is, but he goes through Google Earth all over Ohio, and he's discovered several earthworks that have now been documented just because of him paging through aerial imagery on Google Earth and saying, zooms in and takes a screenshot and sends it to the Ohio Historic Preservation Office, and they're like, okay, yeah. So with that kind of technology, that kind of aerial photography, LiDAR is lasers, shooting lasers down at the ground to measure with like millimeter accuracy relief. So you may look at a field and you don't see any relief. LiDAR can sort of pick up, that much difference that says this is a circle in this field. So all this new technology is just a bonanza for archaeologists. We're getting more data than we know what to do with right now. So yeah, thanks for asking that question. Anything else? Oh, yes, over there. Yep, Jeffers Mound is a Hopewell component here. It was not just a mound, it was also a Hopewell earthwork that went with it. Not much, if anything, is preserved of that. There have been excavations there that show a Hopewell longhouse out beside it that was part of one of these ritual things. Usually those get mounds built on top of them. In this case, that didn't happen, which is kind of interesting. But there has been archaeology done there, and it's sort of the Columbus Hopewell component that we have here. And I'm sure people here were going to Newark for those big observances, like for the northernmost rise of the moon or something, and participating in it there. And they may be some of the people that were close enough to have helped build the earthworks too. Yes, you had a question.
Is there any simple indication why this specific site was chosen?
It's the hardest question to answer is why Newark? Why Chillicothe, whatever? I mean, and I can talk about geography. I mean, this is a triangle of land surrounded by water. Raccoon Creek on the north, South Fork of the Licking River on the east, and Rant Creek at the bottom. So the whole complex is surrounded by water. And that almost makes this, except that it's so big, a microcosm of the indigenous conception of the cosmos, that we are an island floating in a beneath world that's ruled by great horned serpents and underwater panthers, and the sky world above is ruled by the thunderbirds and other spirits of the sky. But we're here in the middle, surrounded by water with water under us, and that means this is surrounded by water, and they imagine that these streams are entranceways to the underworld, and maybe it reflects that water that's beneath us too. And there's only 3 ways. It's not so obvious on this map, but trust me, based on the south map, there are only 3 ways to come into these earthworks without climbing over a wall. One of them is from Raccoon Creek, coming up here, and maybe you stop in that for a sweat lodge or a purification ceremony and then enter the earthworks. Another one is up here from the South Fork of the Licking River. And then this one, it intersects with Rant Creek and then picks up on the other side and goes for 6 miles. Rant Creek is that's 2.5 miles. That is Rant Creek. So it's surrounded by water, so I think that's a spiritual thing. Plus the water is, there's abundant water for drinking for large numbers of people. But the geography you could find other places. For me, it's like, why Jerusalem? Why Mecca? But you don't have a Bible or a Quran to fill in that knowledge of what happened there. What person was there a Buddha or a Moses there that had this gospel? And that's where he lived, and so that's where they did it, that's where she lived. So something happened there that ignited this Hopewell explosion that nobody really talks about, and that's why they did it there. But what it was, I have no idea. And I don't know that we'll ever could possibly know, since they have no written, recorded language. But we know something big happened there. Because this is the biggest connected complex of gigantic earthworks in the world. And like, if this is Ohio, Newark is here, and then all these other ones are down here, and there's only small things like the Jefferson Mountain earthworks that scattered around here. If you follow that line, there are no earthworks, really, between here and Chillicothe. So if it's going at least 6 miles in a perfectly straight line towards Chillicothe, where do you think it's going? Not just out into the wilderness. Not that it was a wilderness back then. That's another misconception that Europeans have. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. See, as opposed to this last question, I know the answer to this one. I can definitively give you the answer to this. Because in 1992, we excavated a trench through the Great Circle. We wanted to understand how it was built. We wanted to understand if it was built in stages. We hoped to find radiocarbon samples to get dates for exactly when it was built. And we didn't get a lot of that information. But we got down to the base. And every other Hopewell earthwork that had ever been excavated up till that point, the base, this is actually almost more incredible. What they did was, if you know anything about soil layers, you've got this A horizon, which is like the black organic layer where all the leaf litter is rotting away. And then you've got successively deeper other levels. So there's A, B, C. B is like a more clay layer where finer particles are settling. And they show up as different colors and different textures. I should be using the mic, I know. So other places, all that organic A horizon had been stripped off before the earthwork was built, maybe to provide a better foundation, I don't know. And they stripped all the interior too, maybe to make a firmer dance floor, so it's all, more firm clay. But when we got to the Great Circle, it's clearly a dark A horizon at the top. So they built it right on the surface that people were walking on. And that was kind of cool thinking about it. This is a surface that these people actually walked on. That's cool. And I was working with a soil scientist from Denison University. I've worked with him on a number of projects. And as we exposed more and more of the soil profile, he kept scratching his head. And it's like, well, what's wrong, Todd? And he said, Brad, that's not a forest soil profile. It's more like a prairie soil profile. And I'm saying, well, Todd, we know what the environment was like 2,000 years ago, and it's a forest. He's like, yeah, I'm not seeing it. And out of curiosity, I took samples of the soil of that A horizon, put them in bags, and we sent them to a paleoethnobotanist. And she was like one of the best in the country. Her name was, what is her name? If I think of it, I'll remember. I want to tell you, because, yeah, she was great. She analyzed the soil, and she wrote back, gave us a report saying, yeah, the pollen here is mostly prairie grasses, and there's phytoliths that are also prairie grasses. There's a little bit of oak and hickory stuff. So oak and hickory trees and stuff are still there. They're just far away, relatively far away. So they're probably on all of the hills surrounding it, but this whole valley was prairie. I mean, it's not technically prairie in this biological sense, but it was grassland. And when I got those results, I was like, but it should have been a forest. And then if you haven't ever read the book 1491, I recommend it, because it's an analysis of America before Europeans got here and messed things up. And it shows that it wasn't a wilderness, that indigenous people in the Americas, just like all over the place, intentionally modified their environment in all kinds of ways. So the people that were cutting down trees and burning off and making prairies allowed more deer to be there, because a forest doesn't have very many deer, but a forest with lots of prairie openings has lots of deer because there's better habitat for them. So people were intentionally creating habitat beneficial to deer so that they could hunt more deer. And so it was probably maybe thousands of years. Maybe people were burning that land off as far, 2,000, or 10,000 years ago, for that matter, with the end of the Ice Age. We don't have an idea, but it was long enough for a soil profile to develop, so centuries at least. So the Hopewell didn't have to go in there and cut down trees and burn everything down so that they could do their stuff. When they got there from Chillicothe, and I think they did come from Chillicothe, they found this huge 4.5 square mile triangle with no trees, just prairie grasses. So they could put a stake in the ground and stretch out a 600-foot long rope and walk in a circle and map out all the geometry. And they could see the horizons unimpeded, so they could watch the moon and the sun. But it was handed to them like that. They came there with this blank slate, and they could put whatever they wanted to on it. And so, I know that for a sure and certain fact. And I can't say that very often. I think those, first opened up the tentative list, because all these countries have a tentative list, and it's basically a short list of sites that they think are worth nominating. And then every year, sometimes every other year, they'll go through that list and say, well, which one should we nominate this year? And when that list, they said, we're opening up the list for new ones because we only have a few left and we want to beef up the list. And we started saying, okay, what are we going to do? We got together with the National Park Service, and we had all these cool Hopewell sites. But we also had Serpent Mound. So it's like, well, should we put that in with it? And of course, when you're making your argument for outstanding universal value, you have this theme of it. And if we had included Serpent Mound, the theme would be cool mounds in Ohio. Possibly not outstanding universal value. So we actually submitted that as another nomination by itself, and it made it to the United States tentative list. So it's still out there on the tentative list. We're hoping someday that it can be nominated for World Heritage Inscription. It's significant. It should be, I think, on the World Heritage list. And then High Banks is mostly a late woodland walled enclosure. So it's a fort, and with a village built inside it. And I think there's also a couple of Adena mounds there too that are older, but there's really nothing Hopewell there. And so we're telling the story of the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. We didn't try to make the story too big and encompass lots of mounds. That's just a focused thing. Okay. Anything else? I have more questions. Yes. Sure. If you ever heard that question, is like, how far back do we know there are earthworks, and could some of the earthworks have been erased by the Ice Age ice sheets? We don't know of any earthworks that date as far back as even 8,000 years ago. And the glaciers are gone from the United States certainly by 10,000, 9,000 years ago. We have the ones in Louisiana that are like, there's mounds down there that are as much as 6,000 or 7,000 years old, like Watson Break, I think. So they start there. Those are the earliest mounds we know of in the Americas. And then there's this Adena and Hopewell. So the Adena starts at about maybe 800 BC, and Hopewell goes all the way up to about AD 400. So there's that period. And they're kind of the same, but Hopewell or the Adena are doing things much smaller. And then there's this big Hopewell explosion where they're doing things bigger, and their network's going wider, and thousands more people are participating. And actually, the Adena continues in like southeastern Ohio, Hocking County, for example, the whole time the Hopewell is going on. And I sort of envision them as kind of being like the Amish off there that don't want anything to do with this newfangled stuff. They're practicing the old ways, the way they want to, the way their parents told them to practice it. And that's kind of interesting in itself. So it's not like the Hopewell become, or the Adena become the Hopewell. It's some Adena changed their ways of life in magnificent ways to become the Hopewell, and others just kept living their own lives somewhere. But so there's that episode of mound building that you could sort of put in one box, with the Adena being just early Hopewell and the Hopewell being later. And then it's not like there's a break, but there kind of is, because there's this big one 4,000, 6,000 years ago in the Louisiana. There's ours, the Hopewell Adena, and then at around 1000 AD, you get this big fluorescence in the Mississippi Valley and in the southeast, like at Moundville, Alabama, and other places, where they're building gigantic cities with big monuments and growing corn. So that's the thing I didn't mention. The Hopewell weren't growing corn. Corn is really important because with corn, you can feed more people per acre than like any of these other plants. But the Hopewell were farmers, but in their gardens, they were growing what's called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. And don't mean to diminish it, but there were things like sunflower, squash, goosefoot, little barley, lamb's quarter, or is that the same as goosefoot? Anyway, there's like 6 or 7 plants that are part of the Eastern Agricultural Complex. And they were actually domesticated plants, domesticated varieties. And so that makes the Ohio and Mississippi Valley one of only 6 or 7 places in the world where local plants were domesticated. Corn doesn't come into the Ohio Valley until about AD 900, long after Hopewell's over. But corn is what allows these Mississippian civilizations to have cities with thousands of people in them, because then they have these big cornfields that are feeding everybody. And I mentioned the guy that lived on top of the pyramid ate lots of meat. Everybody else was eating corn almost entirely. So their teeth were rotting from the sugars. They weren't getting enough nutrition, so their stature declined over the years. All kinds of health issues. Dying from tooth abscesses. So corn is good, but if you're not supplementing it with other things like proteins and other things, then it's not so good. Okay, one more.
I've always been fascinated by Mound Street here in Columbus.
Yeah.
The idea that that was a very high mound, I guess.
Yeah.
Do we have estimates of the heights of these? Because they have to be shorter than they were when they were built, I would think.
Well, we don't think they are that much shorter for a couple reasons. One is that these guys were amazing engineers of soil. But the other is that I came across this analysis the National Park Service did several years ago of some Revolutionary War era embankments, fort embankments that were created, I think it was in Virginia, somewhere in the New England area. So that's not New England, but somewhere where there were Revolutionary War earthworks. And they were testing those, and they determined that once vegetation is established on an earthwork, it becomes very stable. One of my colleagues said it's like having a roof that repairs itself. So it can be damaged, like if a big tree grows on it. Trees mostly help because the root structure helps keep the mound intact too. But if the tree gets old and dies and gets blown down in a storm and the roots ball gets torn up, that causes significant localized damage. And we see episodes of that. But for the most part, once vegetation is established, it's fine. It doesn't erode. This is why we don't want people walking on the earthworks and mounds. Mounds, if they're burial mounds, it's a respect issue primarily, but for intact earthworks of any kind, it's because if enough people walk on it, they'll wear a bare earth path, and then when it rains, significant erosion can be caused. So if you see signs in these parks that say, please don't walk on the mounds, that's why. It's not arbitrary. Yes? Yes. With regard to Newark, I've only got, I think, 4 or 5 radiocarbon dates. So I can't give you the whole chronology. They all tend to lump around AD 300. So I think it was built relatively late. But what I can go on is we've got hundreds of radiocarbon dates for Hopewell Earthworks everywhere. And people have looked at that real carefully. Some people think it starts as early as 100 BC. Our nomination says it doesn't start till 1 AD. There's been a new analysis that says it might not even start till 100 AD. So this just shows you our developing knowledge. I mean, I still would be conservative and say maybe AD 1. But after AD 400, there are no more being built anywhere. None of the ones that have been dated ever say they're older, or if we do get older dates, it turns out they're from a contaminated context. Because there was something called, sorry, I should be using the microphone. There's something called the intrusive mound culture, which is kind of an obnoxious name because during the late woodland, people, this is the period between about, what would that be? 500 AD to maybe 900, maybe as much as 1,000. They were living in larger villages, growing corn, using the bow and arrow. But anyway, they sometimes went to Hopewell and even Edina earthworks and added burials to them. And the archaeologists back in the late 1800s called them the intrusive mound culture because it's like, oh, there's this high civilization and these grubby Indians come along and intrude their awful, primitive burials into the mounds, mess them up. But I mean, these were people who not that many generations previously had been a part of this religion. And I think it's almost kind of an attempt at religious revival. They're burying their ancestors in these mounds of their ancestors, maybe to try to revive the religion or to continue practicing it. But they're no longer building mounds. And so I think intrusive mound is a really bad way to say it. It's like a revivalist, culture or something. So those people sometimes continue to use it. We have traditions. Well, the most reliable one, and that's giving it benefit of the doubt, it's like a game of telephone. Warren K. Moorhead was our first curator of archaeology at the Ohio History Connection. He's working in the late 1800s. And he said, he grew up in Xenia, Ohio. And he said when he was a kid, there was an old guy in the village who either him or his dad, I think, knew Simon Kenton, who's like the Daniel Boone of Ohio. And Simon Kenton told this guy's dad, who told Warren K. Moorhead, that Simon Kenton said that when the Shawnee were moving up and down the Miami Valley, and as they moved back and forth, seasons or whatever, they would always stop at Fort Ancient to honor the spirits of the builders. They didn't necessarily claim that they were descendants, but they stopped there and paid homage to the spirits of the ancestors to acknowledge them. So there was, if not and they probably were among the descendants because the Miami and the Shawnee are some of the ones that have been in that geography, for the longest period of time. So it's certainly their ancestors had some kinds of connections with these people. But they at least recognized them as sacred places and did homage there. And that's the only reliable account I know of anything like that happening. I've got colleagues that just say the fact that American Indians didn't level the mounds to build their villages is an acknowledgement of respect. But I think this testimony about the Miami speaks more powerfully to that feeling a spiritual connection to them, at least. Get 20 more minutes? Well, if you want, I can just hang around for, one question for you, and then we'll quit. But I'll hang around if anybody wants to talk to me personally. Well, I can tell an amusing anecdote but fundamentally, there are no horses in North America until they're reintroduced by Europeans. There are horses during the Ice Age. They're small horses, smallish. They were hunted to extinction or went extinct for other reasons because of climate change. But there's a big gap, and all the modern horses, the horses that American Indians were using trace their lineage to the Spanish horses, in other words. This is the Wells Mound groups. Those are the other burial mounds at Newark. There's only 3 there. This one really was never there. This was published by the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian in their archives has like 4 or 5, like an early version, and then a later revised one, and then another revised one. This is the final printed version. In the version just before this, that north arrow ends there. In this version, they shortened the north arrow, but left behind the arrow fletching that kind of becomes a mound. Because we know there were only 3 mounds in the Wells Mound group. Those mounds were badly beat up, plowed over, and in 1928, one of the Ohio Historical Connection archaeologists excavated what was left and found horse bones in one of them. And we had a couple of them in our collection, and we had somebody who was convinced that horses were here and wanted to radiocarbon date them. And we said, okay. And they radiocarbon dated those bones, and they came back to like 1807 or some, they were 1800s. And so clearly related to some farmer burying his horse in the remnants of an Indian mound. But yeah, we've got lots of radiocarbon dated horse from the late Pleistocene. There's big, huge gap, and nobody has horses until the Spanish bring them in. And I know there's been some controversy about that, but I'm just talking about evidence. I mean, yes?
Could you explain about visiting today? About people being able to go, open?
Sure. It's open to the public now. You can come anytime. The visitor centers are only open, I think, is it Tuesday through Sunday? No, maybe it's Wednesday through Sunday. But on the first Friday of every month, starting in April and going, I think, through November, I give free tours of the Great Circle. They start at 12:30. And then on the third Friday of every month, we are starting now, I'll be giving tours at the Octagon Earthworks at 12:30. And that will be on the Newark Earthworks webpage. They have events and things. But first Fridays, 12:30 at the Great Circle, third Fridays at the Octagon. And the visitor center is the old clubhouse, which is like right here. This is the parking lot in here. Yes?
I wanted to say the visitor center is terrific, and the people that work there are just happy to talk to you about any question you have. And there's some lovely books,
Is it?
books that are available there about the earthworks.
I think. Well, you're probably talking about this visitor center.
Oh, maybe so.
Yeah.
You are in. Some of your writing is in one of the books.
Cool. Yeah. Sadly, I wrote this whole book about Ohio archaeology, and it's out of print now. But I do have. If you know about the internet thing, there's a page called Academia, where academics can put PDFs and stuff. And I put PDFs of all the chapters from my Ohio archaeology book, downloadable for free on Brad Lepper's Academia page. So if you're just on a search engine and just write Academia Brad Lepper, you'll find my page. And I've got a whole bunch of articles, including technical articles that might not be that much fun to read. But I think they're fun. But you can find those chapters of my book, Ohio Archaeology, for all the different periods, including the Middle Woodland Hopewell period. Okay, one more?
Since I mentioned Mound Street and the mound that was apparently there, can you speak to that? I know it's not, your topic today.
Yeah, it's probably an Adena mound, somewhat like Miamisburg Mound, just a big conical burial mound, and they tore it down to use the clay to make bricks for the original State House. It's like, hey, look, a big mound of clay. Let's put that to good use. It's just being wasted there. So there's nothing left but the street to say there was a mound there. Yeah, there's not much else we can know now. And that story is told over and over again in different places around the state, that the mounds were like in the way. I didn't mention, so all of these are mounds that would have had regalia in them just like, or very similar, I imagine, to Hopewell Mound Group or Mound City. But this shows when the Ohio Canal went through. So I think it's that mound that was in this area that had the 20 bushels of mica. The Central Ohio Railroad goes through here, goes right over this largest mound here. And then it even specifies, they said, oh, these are convenient piles of dirt. Let's use those to build the railroad embankment. So it's going level. So the mounds were simply destroyed to be used as fill to build the railroad embankment. And someday, if that railroad ever closes, like I want to excavate the embankment to see what's in there, because it could be amazing stuff. All right, well, thank you very much. I'll hang around for a little bit and you can chat with me.